Hey guys, here we are for section 3. We'll wrap up chapter 12, air, and today we're going to talk about acid precipitation. As these various pollutants go up into the air, well, whatever goes up must come down. And a lot of times it's in the form of acid precipitation. Your essential question: how does acid precipitation affect plants, soil, and aquatic ecosystems? It has an effect on all of them. What is it? Well, as we jump in right off the bat, what causes acid precipitation? Where does it come from? How does it happen? Well, in general, acid precipitation is any precipitation, rain, sleet, snow, hail, any way that the water falls out of the clouds that has high concentrations of acid because of pollution. Now, acid rain occurs to a degree if you just think pure pH. pH of 7 is neutral. Anything below 7 is acidic. But we do talk about acid rain hitting a specific pH. Anyway, as we burn fossil fuels, namely oil and coal, they release oxides of sulfur and nitrogen into the air. They're just part of the mix. Remember, these were living things. We have sulfur, nitrogen, phosphates, part of our body. When these things die, they're still there. When we burn them, they get released in the form of gases. Now, when these various oxides, and for the most part, we're going to talk about sulfur oxides and nitrogen oxides, they can form sulfuric acid and nitric acid. And then this falls back to the ground as acid rain, acid precipitation. So the little picture up here, just showing the super simple aspect. We get sulfur dioxide and nitrogen dioxide up in the atmosphere. They mix with H2O. So SO2 mixes with the water and it forms H2SO4. Nitrous oxide, NO2, forms up with the water in the air and can form HNO3. Sulfuric acid, nitric acid. Now, they're not highly concentrated forms. They're mixed with an awful lot of water, but they are enough to change the pH of the water as it falls, and you change the pH enough and it causes problems on the ground. So what are these problems, right? Well, this acidic water flows over and through the ground, right? It comes out of the sky, water flows downhill, follows the path of least resistance. So it's going to flow down into, obviously, our streams, rivers, and lakes, and eventually can make their way down into the ocean. And obviously, acid rain is falling directly into the ocean. All of these occur. Now, acid rain can kill living things and can cause the decline or loss of some local animal and plant populations. Once again, anything gets too acidic and it's a problem. As we mentioned before, the pH value, 7 is the magical number. 7 is neutral. Now, pure water, H2O, not our tap water because there's stuff in that, but pure distilled H2O has a pH of 7.0, truly neutral. Anything above 7 is basic, a base or alkaline. Anything below 7 is an acid, acidic. So, normal precipitation, because of carbon dioxide, animals are breathing out carbon dioxide, a forest fire happens, there's carbon dioxide, a plant rots in the ground and releases carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide being released into the atmosphere is a completely normal, natural process occurring all the time. Usually we talk about it in concerns of humans adding more, but in general there is CO2 in the atmosphere. CO2 combines with water to form H2CO3, carbonic acid. So rain is always a little bit acidic. It's usually in the range of about 5.6, if you will. So that would just be normal rainfall. And we talk about this pH scale. I'll throw the little chart up here behind us. We'll do this in a lab as well, but in general, right at 7 is water. Anything below that or above it in the pH 8 you're getting into like human blood, seawater, because it's got a lot of other minerals in it. Then you get down in the 9s and the 10s, and you're talking about detergents, and you get down to 12 into 14, and you're into some pretty heavy chemicals, household ammonia, you get into Drano, things of this nature. Very, very basic. The other end of the scale, getting lower and lower and lower in pH, gets acidic. Tomato juice around 4, lemon juice around 2. Then when you get down to the 1s and below, we're getting into true concentrated acids. So a 5.6 is normal, but when it gets below 5, that's when we refer to it as acid rain or acid precipitation, because a lot of times this is coming down in the form of snowfall. So always slightly there, but that's our line. 5.6 is normal. We consider 5.1 perfectly fine. It's going to occur. It dips below that, and that's when we start to get issues or problems. Because as acidic rain falls to the ground, then it hits the ground, and if it was normally a pH of 7.3 and we get 4.8 hitting the ground, well, it becomes more acidic. It's not what it used to be. It's accustomed to the 5.6, but enough can make a change. So the pH of different areas varies. And a lot of it depends on the amount of industry that might be there. The pH of precipitation in the eastern US and Canada ranges anywhere from 4.2 to 4.8. It gets pretty high because all of the industry, especially up in our northeastern corridor where we're doing a lot of industry. We literally produce a lot of our steel, etc. there. So all of these pollutants going into the atmosphere then fall back down. So we tend to get a higher pH level on the East Coast than we do out in the Midwest or even the West Coast. Now, acid precipitation is going to cause a drop in the pH of soil. Once again, pH is going down, therefore more acidic. And this increases the concentration of the acid. So we refer to this as acidification. So there can be acidification of soil, there can be acidification of a lake, there can be acidification of the ocean. And our ocean has become to get more and more acidic, causing issues and problems, especially for coral reefs. They're so sensitive. But as the acidity increases, this causes some nutrients to wash out more often, right? Erosion. We have normal erosion, just physical erosion, but we also get chemical erosion. So when it's raining and the rain is more acidic, we get both physical erosion from the water running over the things, and then we get chemical erosion, and it tends to wash out a lot of these minerals and into the ground and our water supplies. It also tends to react with other metals, and some of these wind up being toxic. Aluminum, mercury, some of these also get more affected by the acidity, causing more to run out into the ground. Also, the sulfur dioxide in water vapor can actually clog the openings of pores. It winds up, kind of like if you've ever seen limestone build up around something. Sulfur does the same thing. It's a mineral, and the mineral deposits build up, and it can actually cause the plants to get clogged, and they can't respire, they can't breathe. This causes problems, and they can't die from it. And also, aquatic animals are adapted to live in a particular pH range. Boy, when I was in graduate school, we had a particular fish. It was an Amazonian cichlid, if you will, but it was a discus fish. I'll throw a picture up here. Beautiful fish, but it needed a high pH, so basic. It had to have a pH a little bit over 8. And the pH of the water naturally where we lived at the time, New Orleans, was always like about 7.2. And it was always difficult to keep the pH high enough because it kept wanting to reduce. Anyway, all this to say, certain organisms that are adapted to live in a particular pH. And if the pH falls too low, becomes more acidic, it can kill the various plants and or animals in that area, obviously disrupting the food web in that area, causing problems. It can also cause, as we've talked about, the aluminum and mercury, other toxic metals as well, to erode quicker than they normally do. Now, aluminum, although we use aluminum all the time and don't think about it, dissolved aluminum in the water accumulates in a fish's gills. and it keeps them being able to take as much oxygen out of the water. So even though there might be enough oxygen in the water, the aluminum that accumulates in their gills keeps them from being able to pull it out, and the fish can actually slowly suffocate. This would be akin to somebody with emphysema. You know, they have lungs and they're breathing in enough oxygen, but their lungs can't take enough oxygen in because there's so much damage in their lungs, they can't get enough oxygen. A similar sort of thing. The aluminum in a fish's gills causes them to suffocate. So aluminum poisoning, if you will, for a fish can be really bad. Another term that we talk about is acid shock. So we get the acid rain, etc. This is a sudden large runoff of lots of acidic water into lakes, streams, etc. Now, a lot of times this occurs with a snowmelt because we've had acid rain precipitating, but it's cold and it's up in the mountains. So we've had this 4.2 snow falling and 4.3 snowing and 4.4 and 4.2 and 4.8. And it's all snowing and it's accumulating, right? And then springtime comes. What happens in spring? The snow melts. Now, all of a sudden, all of this, let's say it's an average of 4.4 water, goes rushing into the rivers, into the streams, into the lakes. And this is acidic shock. Now, it could just be a really heavy rain. If it's been a long time before rain and the sulfur dioxides and nitric oxides have been building up in the atmosphere, and then it all rains at once. So it can come from a rainstorm, but a lot of times it's from snowmelt because it's been accumulating and it all melts at once. This can cause large numbers of fish populations to die, like you see in this picture of the lake behind me here. Acid shock can be really harsh. Also, not only do the fish die, but a lot of them that survive and remain, it affects their reproduction. They produce fewer eggs. A lot of the eggs they do actually lay don't hatch because the high levels of acid affect the reproductive lifespan or cycle of specifically amphibians and a lot of the fish. Once again, they're laying eggs in the water. Those eggs are very susceptible to whatever is in the water, and they get damaged and can't hatch. So we wind up getting those big fish kill-offs, and then the next season when it's time for fish and amphibians to hatch, not as many do. And we see a huge drop-off in the lake affecting the food web, which disrupts the entire thing. Now, if we've talked about toxic metals such as aluminum and mercury can be released, they find their way into everything. It's not just into the lakes. They find their way into crops. They find their way into the fish. So mercury, the fish are out there taking it in. They're eating the food that's mercury tainted, and the fish wind up with higher concentrations of mercury. And research has even shown that there is a correlation between high amounts of acid precipitation and respiratory problems, specifically in children. We're not exactly sure what some of the link, but more than likely is they're breathing some of this in the vapors in, causing problems with their lungs. This is why a lot of times you'll see warnings on fish. Or if you go fishing in lakes, they'll say, if you're pregnant or etc., you should eat no more than one fish every 3 months or something caught from this area. Because we know there's amounts of mercury leaking into the lake and it's getting into the fish population. Biomagnification. It starts off in low levels here, but as small fish eat the plants and bigger fish eat those plants, it climbs up, and then you and I are eating multiple fish and we're getting way too high accounts of mercury, aluminum, and all these things can cause problems. Not to mention just somebody's standard of living can be affected by this. Imagine you're a fisherman on a particular, like the Great Lakes or something, and you go out and you're normally doing fishing, and then you get one of these big acid, not spill, but a heavy acid rain, so the fish go into toxic shock and die, or acid shock and die. Well, your livelihood's gone, at least for this season. So it has an economic effect on commercial fishermen, a sport fisherman. You know, you're out here and we're gonna take people like deep sea fishing or fishing in these areas, you're a local guide, and now the fish are dead, you're out of business. So it affects fishermen, affects anybody trying to have recreation on the lakes, right? Also, forestry gets affected. trees, as you can see back here, also get affected by this acid rain. Changes the soil, the trees can't grow, and the trees die. So our forestry can be drastically affected by acid rain. Things haven't had a chance to adapt. They adapted to this soil over thousands and thousands of years, but now in a manner of 100 years or so, the acid levels are changing. And geologically speaking, or evolutionarily speaking, 100 years is pretty quick for plants to be able to change and adapt to these situations. Also, acid precipitation dissolves calcium carbonate. Calcium carbonate is basically like limestone. It's a type of sedimentary rock. And this is much more liable, is that the right word? Much more likely to get chemical erosion from it. Granite, the acids don't bother too much. Limestone, they do. It literally bubbles and eats it away. And you can take a look at the picture back here. This is 60-year difference in a statue. So on the left-hand side, you can see the features clearly, but 60, 70 years of acid rain in this area and the features are gone. It's just a generic silhouette of a woman. We can't see facial features anymore. The folds in the gown are completely eroded and worn off. And this is all from chemical erosion. And, you know, unfortunately, a lot of our building supplies are concrete, right? And this is what calcium carbonate is. It's one of the main ingredients in that. And it is very susceptible to acid rain and chemical erosion from it. One of the problems in trying to control it is we talk about international conflicts from it. Because one area may be producing the nitrogen oxide and the sulfur dioxides in the factory, but then those pollutants are being carried downwind and it's going into an entire other country or other region. They're making the problem, but they're reaping the downfall of the acid precipitation. For example, much of the acid precipitation that falls in southeastern Canada is a result of pollution that's produced in the northeastern United States. That northeastern corridor is a lot of industry there, and that wind comes up from the Gulf Stream, right? Pushes it up and over, and it goes into southeastern Canada. Southeastern Canada isn't making the pollutants, but they're getting the problem from it. If you look at the picture back here, we talk about these international conflicts. Green, those are the areas that are producing the oxides into the air that can turn into acid rain. The areas in blue, these are suffering from acid rain problems. Now it's kind of hard to see, but it's not the area of Florida that's producing the problems, but we are getting fallout from it. So all up our eastern seaboard, and once again, strongly up into Canada, they're all getting issues from it. And then the purple are areas with high risk, depending on how the winds change. So you can see the areas of green where it's getting produced are not always the area that's really having the problems from it. They're often in other areas. So because of this, because the acid precipitation is going to fall downwind, obviously if the wind's blowing here, well, that's where the rains are going to fall, away from the basic area. Canada and the United States signed a Canada-US air quality agreement back in 1991. And both countries agreed to reduce the acidic emissions. You know, Canada was like, we're getting a problem from you, but you know what? We will commit to lowering our emissions if you'll commit to lowering yours. Canada's like, you know what? We'll do our part. Even though it's not affecting you, we'll cut ours down as long as you'll cut yours down. And we made an agreement to do that. Similar agreements throughout Europe are occurring, and I really feel like we're turning a corner in trying to wean ourselves off of coal and oil and develop much more renewable energy sources. The big two right now, of course, are solar and wind. There's a lot of hydroelectric power out there, but if we can build a dam and get hydroelectric power from it, we largely already have. So that's not an area that's likely to increase, but solar and wind are showing huge promise. And we'll look at in another chapter, there's a lot of new ideas that are coming online. They're not quite ready yet, but we're getting close. Guys, that wraps it up for chapter 12, looking at air and a lot of times just the way we get polluted or how the pollution affects us within the air qualities. Take care, and we'll see you next time.